Rick Wagner and Larry Burns this morning.
AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.
All right, Mr. Gary.
How are you?
You got something to surprise me with this week?
I've got one that is going to be impossibly hard or dead easy. And it's the same thing.
Okay.
Do you want the hard one?
Sure.
If I give you the easy one, you'll guess right away.
Okay.
Okay, so there was a guy who was a chief engineer, okay,
Mhm.
which is a pretty good job, chief engineer, right? And he had a job, and he quit his job on August 15th, which is today's August 15th. I'm not going to tell you what year it was, but August 15th. Okay, so this is a chief engineer, and you guys would, everybody in the studio would know who this person was. So
Okay.
he quits his job. So a few years later, he's at a car company, and he's part of the development of a vehicle that everybody here knows. Who is this person?
So when you were first talking, my mind went to Walter P. Chrysler.
Wow.
But then you said he was working at another company. Well, of course he was working at another company, but it was his own. So this sounds like somebody who did not start his own company.
I'm not giving you clues.
Yeah. Okay, so everybody's got to know we got Mark Wakefield from AlixPartners and Keith Naughton from Bloomberg. What do you guys think? Any ideas?
God, I'm racking. One person who changed jobs, though I don't think he was ever a chief engineer, was Bob Lutz, and he fathered some famous vehicles. But
Not Bob Lutz.
Not Bob. He was never a chief engineer, I don't
Right.
think. Mark, you got any stabs in the...
August 15th. I mean, now I don't really keep track of the dates that people. Sounds like it's a startup-y guy though, like a Tesla Rivian person. So I'm trying
Startup-y
to
guy.
think through-
Startup-y
so I'm
guy's
trying to
good.
think of
Startup-y
who-
guys.
Oh, Peter Rawlinson?
He wasn't. Was he a chief engineer?
He was chief
Yeah.
engineer on
Yeah, the Model
S.
S.
Okay.
All right. So
Okay.
Since
so
we're
I'm
not
gonna
going together.
give you
All right,
the.
we're teaming up
I'm
on
gonna,
that one.
I'm gonna give you the date, and then you'll immediately see. If I gave you the date first, you'd immediately know
Year, is
what
it?
it was.
Okay.
Okay. 1899.
oh,
Oh, Jesus. Okay.
Ferdinand Porsche. Not Ferdinand
Oh
Porsche.
God, I thought you'd.
Auto.
Yeah.
Auto
Henry
Benz.
Ford.
Bingo.
Ah,
There we go.
Henry was in the business at 1899?
Yeah, but actually, he was working as a chief engineer for Edison.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Okay.
And Edison did make cars.
They did not.
Not at that time.
Not at that time.
He
but,
did make a successful model later
Yeah.
for a different company.
but I always find this interesting that so he leaves August of 1899 and goes to work for the Detroit Automobile Company, which had a 18-month run before it went bankrupt,
Right.
and it made trucks.
Oh.
And then he started the Henry Ford Company, right?
Mhm.
It
And
went bankrupt.
and well, it sort of went. He left, and then it was turned into Cadillac.
Correct.
And then in 1903, he started the Ford Motor Company.
Right.
It shows you startups are hard.
That's right.
They are.
Yeah,
very
that was his
successful.
third company.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in fact, who's the guy that started Cadillac? Was the
Henry Leland.
Henry Leland, right? There's, so Henry Ford was miffed at Henry Leland
Yeah.
because, and fast forward to, was it 1926? I think
When they
Henry
did,
Ford bought Lincoln, and there's a picture of Henry and his son Edsel with Henry Leland with his son, and Henry Leland looks like he does not look happy. And Henry Ford looks like the cat that just ate the canary.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like he was so pleased he was yanking this company out from under Henry Leland.
Edsel could look a little stressed at times too.
Mhm.
Yes, he could. Yeah, but that was because of Dad.
Yeah, I know.
I think everyone around him might have been stressed.
So speaking of companies that are successful and companies that may go bankrupt, Mark, how are you?
yeah.
I'm not sure which I am of those, but okay. I like working for both.
Well, no, not working, but I mean, you guys recently did another study of the industry, which leads me to believe that there is going to be some churn in this industry, more than there is now.
Yeah, and the future probably does go to the brave because.
So let's set the stage a little bit more and have you pick it up from
Okay.
there. So you guys are looking at the Chinese auto industry, and man, this thing's
We
a
are.
juggernaut. This thing's a steamroller.
Yeah.
And what you guys essentially came out and warned the legacy industry. I don't want to call it the Western because this includes
No.
Japan and South Korea too.
Absolutely.
But the legacies
And Europe.
better
Yep.
change or else.
Yeah, in a quantum way too. And we've talked last year about some of this ways to maybe separate and do other things. This year we tried to bring it up a level to talk about particularly product development, but about just getting out of the boiling pot.
What do you mean by
because-
that?
Well, it can feel good with, and there's some people are feeling very good about the lack of BEV takeoff and how this is all playing out and how much demand there is for ICE vehicles. But the competitive dynamics that are going on in China and BYD's ascension in that, not just them though, Li Auto, a few others are pretty impressive, are painting the picture of a new operating model that even if it's held out of the US, and even if it's held out of Europe, which is less likely with building factories there and such, someone else could replicate that, and it's a winning model. And it's tried and true in China, and now somewhat scary if we don't do more quantum changes to the fundamental approaches and how we're organized, not just going a little faster or being a little more innovative. Like, it's not whipping people harder or hiring smarter people. It's changing how we work. And without that, we could wake up in 5 years and be too late, because the compounding improvement and changes that are going on in the knife fight that is China will eventually spill over.
So you see the Chinese automakers having, what, 33% of the market of the global
Yeah.
market by 2030?
Yes.
So they lead in EVs, they lead in technology, they lead in supply chain, they lead in cost. I'm
Mhm.
struggling to see the opportunity for anyone else, and feeling that 33% is low.
Well, you have protectionism, so it's still in play at that point. So in our 2030, we had a 1% market share in the US, like a 20-something% in Mexico, as an example. But the bigger issue is it's not written yet. There's enough things to play that there's time to move and time to do things. The market in Europe and North America is not heavily BEV yet. We aren't really on what we call like a level 4 of SDVs with real-time immersive connections. These things are still being written. The autonomous side still being written. And even the battery electric side, the chemistries are moving fast. It's not like you're too late now, but let a few generations go and run just for cash. And instead of running for a decades-long winning strategy, and there may not be decades longness out there.
So you guys found that they have a cost advantage as much as 35%, product development times twice as fast, as little as 20 months. Higher vertical integration as much as 75%, 20 times over-the-air updates post-launch.
Yeah.
Okay, couldn't someone in a Western company simply say, hey, China's car companies are basically state-owned. That's direction from the top. It's government controlled.
Mhm.
We're free market. That's just ridiculous. We're not going to do it.
Well, we're not free market, or else they'd be here right now. It's probably a thankful thing for many. But BYD, Li Auto, Geely, others are not the state-owned ones. Yes, they have support locally and otherwise. NIO, a lot of support. Others, some substantial support. But they aren't the FAW, SAIC traditionals, right? It's actually a new breed in China that are winning in this, and that are actually taking share from the traditional Chinese brands in China as well. It's just that the two of those combined are demolishing the Western auto brands in China. So it's you were saying that the up twos, and not all of them are up to quite that amount, but there's a competitive advantage to the way they're organized. And it's not just saying, I'm going to launch in 20 months. It's saying, I'm going to launch in 20 months and setting up the things required to do that, and to be able to do the OTAs afterwards and being willing to do those, being willing to prioritize and focus on just what matters in the requirements to customers and to a competitive nature, and then a fundamental belief that if I don't launch this in 20 months, it's dead. So time is not a variable, because there's not an opportunity to compete with a 1-year-old vehicle launching in China. You'd be a technology past in the generation. Everyone looked at the Xiaomi SU7 and went, "Oh my God, let's go faster, let's put more in." They looked at all these different vehicles. Each one that comes out reinforces the idea that to win in the NEV market in China, time can't be a variable. You must launch. And it can succeed or fail, but you're guaranteed to fail to take an extra year.
Mark, when I talk to people about this need for the legacies to change,
Yeah.
and these advantages that the Chinese have,
Yeah.
there's so much denial. And if it goes beyond denial, it's like, well, they get all access to these low-cost loans. The government is supporting them. Uyghur labor, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
What's your response to that?
So what? Compete. I don't know if there are aspects of that matter. And there's also brand legacies that matter a lot, and that have an advantage of some brands that mean a lot and have a lot of trust in luxury and quality and other areas that the Chinese don't sell on that. They sell on, features and this sort of thing. It's like there's not an Apple-based selling piece. It's more, NIO's trying to do a bit of that, but it's much more of a Samsung style cell phone sell of, look at this feature, look at this stuff that I can do. So there's an opportunity to leverage some of those things. It's not that there's only one way of doing it and only one set of competitive advantages. You could take a different approach, but to ignore 20 months, to ignore the totally reorganized product development without chassis, body, instead hardware and software, a CI/CD, like continuous development, continuous software development layer that's just has a hardware connection layer to it, but it's not coupled to the hardware and is able to continually innovate along agile cycles. This exists. It's real, and it's better, and it's producing better vehicles. And it's vehicles you couldn't have done this 20 years ago because the software, the electronics wasn't available. It's easier in the EVs, but it's happening in the Reeves as well, the extended range ones. And so I would say you still have to look at the advantages and what are people doing and what can I do or do better, with or without some state subsidies or other things going on. And even the cultures. The 996 culture is alive and well.
What do you mean 996?
9 to 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week as the sort of the shtick in China for these startups. We were talking to a Western company who's trying to hire a new team in China, and they were dismayed because a lot of the people they were interviewing were excited to go work for them because they wouldn't have to work so hard. And so there is other aspects there that are daunting when you say, okay, how do I set up my culture and my structure and my processes and be willing to clean sheet it enough to make something that fights this off and takes advantage of it. Because even if you and I are both making cars here and no one actually does come in, but I do those changes and you don't, I'm going to beat you. So I don't really even understand the focus of will they or won't they come. And it's not so much about a Chinese player like BYD coming as much as it is the quantum changes that are being shown to be better.
I wanted to ask about one aspect of the clean sheet, though. So organized labor is innocent in this country. The UAW in particular just negotiated their most lucrative contract in decades. They just organized Volkswagen. So how do you overcome those labor costs? How do you get competitive on labor costs without somehow severing ties with the United Auto Workers, which doesn't seem likely in this country?
I don't think labor isn't a huge portion of the cost structure compared to, say, the battery chemistry, for example. If it's $1 billion to launch a vehicle and I take an extra year, I've spent a couple $100 million extra. If I don't do virtualized testing, I've spent another couple $100 million there. So there's other big things that are there. And then the labor piece comes down to economics of the, automation, cobots, what's the labor rate in Mexico, and taking an approach of, fortunately, coldly looking at what's the best outcome for the industrial apparatus that I want to put together. We talked a bunch last year about different ways of setting up a factory and these sort of things, and those are things you could do. They're a lot easier to do if you do a structural change like this, but those also reduce the number of heads needed, so it can be less, which a union can choose to say, I'm going to try to hold on to a number of jobs and create uneconomic waste, or I'm going to try to organize other things and make sure everyone has good rights and isn't taken advantage of, but be economic players in terms of how many jobs are actually needed and the humane retraining or severing of employees. So I don't think it's incompatible with a progressive UAW approach. Sorry, left my phone out there, but my watch still stuck me.
We had Merrick
Masters
in here. He's an industrial relations expert, and his observation, I totally agree with it, by the way, is it's not so much the wage rates, it's the lines of demarcation, it's the work rules, it's the inflexibility that the union brings to any kind of shop. That's the real issue.
It is the us versus them is a real issue. You've walked the Toyota and Honda floors with the jumpsuits and not really telling who's who other than who everyone pays attention to. There's a sense of everyone in it together in good factories, some union factories too. It's a little easier to be us versus them and two parties in a unionized one, and particularly one where jobs are shrinking. That's a difficult situation. Remember, unions came into play not because of, hey, we need this to do this thing. It was because of abuses of the automakers and others to protect. So if you believe your fundamental role is to protect, it can be limiting, and you can get to a local maximum pretty quickly instead of the global maximum of actually working together. So I think it depends, but I think the wage rate doesn't help. It makes automation in Mexico more attractive.
Does 996 also include the engineering staff that's involved in doing these things?
Yeah.
And so the thing that I wonder about is that this isn't an issue of just a trade union movement, whether it's here or other European countries, but I mean it's a whole cultural thing. I mean, whether you're in Germany or in England or France or the United States, if somebody told you you're working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, they'd be against it, whether this is at Starbucks or Walmart or General Motors.
It would be, unless you have, particularly China and the US, very aspirational culture that wants to succeed, that wants the hero entrepreneur and the hero business person, and aggrandizes that compared to a European that's maybe more doctor, lawyer, formerly priest, kind of aggrandized thing. And the capitalist is a mercantilist, second tier person. Particularly, Silicon Valley has a tremendous history of people working to the bone to accomplish fantastic things.
There's always been a pot of gold at the end of that
rainbow.
There's a pot of gold at the end,
but even in this town, I mean, you guys have all been through some launches that people put in heroic amounts of effort to get out the door and to do tremendous things. It's a vehicle I was when you started your chief engineer thing, I was thinking of a certain chief engineer that just retired that worked through something with his team, was fantastically devoted to launching that vehicle. And that mode sort of propagates itself and reinforces itself and then becomes success. When things are allowed to settle, it gets uncomfortable because somebody else isn't comfortable.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering if everything that we're talking about is how the legacy automakers can catch up to what China's already doing. I'm just wondering if there are any opportunities to leap ahead. In the United States, the domestic automakers do pickup trucks better than anybody else, right?
Yeah.
Somebody always has their area of expertise that gives them an edge and keeps them alive.
Yeah.
So what is the edge that the legacy automakers would have over the Chinese?
I wouldn't say it's an edge. They have brand edge in many different ways. They have a fairly homogeneous market that has FMVSS type walls around it and other things that make it a somewhat unique market compared to others that allows them to grow to scale. Like in China, there's a few profitable, there's a ton massively unprofitable, right? Until you get to like 400,000 or 500,000 units, you have no prayer. So there is a lot of that going on there too, that make it more difficult than here. It's nice not to have 130 automakers competing with you in the United States. However, the bigger reaches are the broader out there. I'm talking about more nuts and bolts of what needs to be done now for the 5 years from now vehicles and approach. The 20 years out thing, you get into autonomous pods that are built for 3 years of life and then disposable. You get into multimodal and taking out train and plane and autonomous on highway in between things. All the fun moonshotty things to think about, and then expanding the pool of who's mobile into goods and people to make sure deadheading isn't as much there. Handicap, old, young, autonomous unlocks a lot of those things, which is the fun iPhone moment to think about in the auto industry. And the U.S. is very well poised to have a great shot at that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go back to what you've been talking about, though, of how the legacies essentially need to reinvent themselves or restructure themselves. Yeah. If you were a CEO looking at a legacy company, where would you start? I mean, here are companies, in most cases that we're talking about, been around 100 years. They have 100 years of policies and procedures and ways of doing things. How do you start even the process of change, and what changes do you make?
Well, you don't do it by consensus, probably. You do it with a plan, and you do it recognizing that you want those vehicles that are out there in the market now to continue to be producing cash, but you need to make fundamental changes going forward. So the sunk cost of, but I validated this and I have this platform and I'd like to reuse this, those pieces have to be killed, and it has to go into a step change of, okay, I'm going to totally revamp my product development into hardware and software. And these are going to be completely separate types of organizations, the software being continuous, the hardware being launch and leave type things. I'm going to set my manufacturing in a different way to do more vertical integration and to think of a supply chain in a completely different way as a network of things versus a vertical supply chain that I'm trying to get the right cost. I'm trying to dual source and trying to have economic leverage rather than sort of abusive leverage over my supply chain. And I'm going to build in things that allow me to be flexible with volumes and scale and build units of scale and capacity rather than trying to go for the big thing that looks great on a spreadsheet. But if it's off 20% up or down, it's a disaster of industrial economics. I would figure out how to revamp my branding to go after. It's a lot easier on an NEV to say, on a REV or a battery electric vehicle, really to start with a different brand or a brand that isn't also trying to sell an old style vehicle, and kind of separating the company into two approaches. There's a whole bunch of stuff that has to change for the future ones, and even then, if I'm killing a evolutionary vehicle that's going to launch in 2 years for something that's going to launch in 3 that's ground up, so be it. But those are kinds of things I would change right away. And it would be doing it in a way that's got a plan in place to be able to execute, not with a hope that it produces something good. There's a bit too much of this sort of, well, if I do agile scrums, that'll just work itself out. It has to be in concert with the architecture. It has to be in concert with the way you're going to do the manufacturing and the way you're going to do the OTAs after, the way you're going to even interact with the customer in the vehicle. And the way you're going to get revenues then to match more recurring revenues that match my recurring costs of those services I'm providing, and lesser costs, not just added revenue, lesser costs in the hardware side.
But I mean, what becomes the moment when someone decides they need to do this? I mean, it strikes me that you guys discovered that when you surveyed in China that there was basically price parity with an EV and an ICE vehicle, that there was a good charging network, and that there was a benefit in terms of licensing. Okay, so advantage. Here and in Western Europe, you guys discovered it's a 35 to 55% price penalty to get an EV. So what are we seeing in Europe and what are we seeing here? Oh, a greater interest in hybrids and plug-in hybrids, right?
Yeah.
So if someone is saying, gee, we were all in on EVs, but now we want to be able to provide hybrids and plug-ins because this is what the market wants.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you reconcile these two things? Because it seems to me that you would immediately default to the legacy approach in order to provide those hybrids and plugins.
That's where I think it likely makes sense to somewhat separate companies, and more so than people have done to date, which is a bit more customer.
When you say
facing.
separate companies, you mean
Spin-offs?
you need an internal startup along with the legacy ops?
Probably as not more than that, an actual separation of parts of the company into two separate companies.
So not Saturn and the rest of General Motors.
No, spin-off.
And not the skunk works or pilot things, or not the It's good to pilot things in those sorts of things to see if an approach works given the freedom of it. But to then do it at an industrial scale, it takes
A new company.
and really a carved out piece that operates with the freedom to change the way it's operating.
Interesting what you're saying, because we're seeing GM and Ford take two different approaches. Ford doing the skunk works, maybe going to grow a new company. GM saying, no, we're keeping it integrated.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really tough to keep it integrated. Both of them are still fairly integrated.
Yes. Yes.
The
Too much so.
Yeah, they're fairly integrated, and I think that holds them back considerably. There's no real difference in how a supplier sells to Ford an EV part versus an ICE part, for example. The relationship isn't much different. The approach to validating and going through a vehicle isn't terribly different, and it needs to be. And the way requirements are set, the way the business case is set, and decisions get made, that needs to be different, and that's hard to do in an evolutionary way. Maybe it's not impossible. We'll see. It would seem to be a lot easier to burn a bridge than be tempted to go back across the bridge each day.
I'd like to continue. We got to take a quick commercial break right now. We're going to give a shout out to Bridgestone, the sponsor that makes this show possible.
When the elements are working against you, being confident in your grip on the road is what really matters. Bridgestone Alenza tires, improved acceleration in wet conditions.
Okay, we're back talking with Mark Wakefield from AlixPartners. Keith Naughton from Bloomberg is here with us too. So let's just finish that thought, then I'll let the other guys jump in. But okay, so your advice is start a whole new company within or separate from, but it's still your effort.
Yeah.
Well, what do you do with the legacy then? I mean, how do you wind that down? What do you do? Do you cross-pollinate? What do you do?
It doesn't go away for a long time, but it's operating in a different context.
Has
Where
anyone ever done this?
Not really, no.
Even outside the
Oh yeah,
auto
outside,
industry?
absolutely. I mean, you look at
Kellogg.
IBM, you look at Microsoft, you look at a number of companies that went through significant pivots. They didn't completely abandon and stop. They sort of created new. The cloud in Microsoft was a big, difficult change because they were making great money on those CDs they were sending out with Microsoft Office. Do they regret making the change? God, no. Moving from selling the DVD games or the CD games also to the Xbox environment. Do they regret that move? Absolutely not. Does Kodak regret not moving to digital? Yeah, probably. So yes, outside of automotive, there are some good examples, and there are people trying different flavors of it within automotive. But it's the temptation to go back across the bridge and not be as quantum and as distinctly different is very much there.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of government in all of this. We touched
Yep.
on it a little bit. Government is currently, U.S. government, keeping Chinese EVs out. I have this story that you're quoted in this week in Business Week about the extended range EVs. And I can't tell you the number of people I've heard from saying, how can I get one of these? And I said, well, move to China. So
L6, L9s. Are
yes,
nice.
you drove around in a Li Auto L9 in China. So is government helping, or are they leading to the deindustrialization of America?
Well, at least there is more of an industrial policy now, because that was a bad, dirty word for a good 30 years, I think.
True.
And that's no longer really on both sides of the aisle. The idea that government can be involved and shape it, while different views of how that goes, is sort of a recognition that what China was doing and has been doing in their 5-year plans and their longer plans isn't necessarily playing fair, and one needs to fight fire with fire to a degree. So I think there's definitely attempts at it. Some of it gets a bit blunt, and it's tough not to be blunt, I think, as a government when you're doing things. But the focus, like the IRA on batteries and battery things, maybe pushes uneconomic stuff if there isn't a charging network and infrastructure there. It's better in China. It's not great, but it's better in China. It's tough to do a chicken and egg thing, though, if you're trying to do what the U.S. government is trying to do, and trying to sort of protect jobs somewhat, protect companies somewhat, but not put too many thumbs on the scale, and yet put these stretch goals out. Mm-hmm. And they've backed off and backed off and backed off on the both California as well as the federal, as they hit the wall of realities each time. The IRA, if that were to go away, would change dramatically. I would hope it doesn't, because whether it's good or bad policy, stable policy is actually probably the most important thing first. Secondly, what is that policy? So we're seeing more industrial policy, good. The charging network and infrastructure is well behind. And then the over-focus on battery over other aspects of the industry is a little blunt. And it's protective versus front-footed.
I wonder if it's, we talked about protecting jobs and protecting companies. I wonder if it's even consumer friendly. I come back to EREVs. You can't get one here, and people would like them.
Yeah, I think part of that comes from, and it's going to be somewhat addressed in the CAFE targets. It's no longer a 3x, or won't be a 3x benefit for a BEV on the EMPG anymore. Mm-hmm. It's going to be like 1.5 by 2027. I think that starts to go down. So that normalization, that was a big thumb on the scale of BEV, right? Mm-hmm. You've got also the truck car split. That's a big thumb on the scale of truck and big heavy. Even the footprint curve is another big thumb on the scale of make a big vehicle. So there are regulatory thumbs on the scale that lead away from an EREV. The extended range piece, though, it comes down to I think you will be seeing many more coming in the next 5 years.
So, I mean, what role does the market have? I mean, we're talking about government. Okay, so there, the $7,500 incentive. I mean, what if that goes away like that? What happens to this market in terms of the demand for EVs? I've got to believe it'll be significantly lower.
Yeah, it will be lower. Yeah.
And yet, as you point out, the auto companies are competing with some fairly quick, agile, savvy Chinese companies that are full bore on EVs. So if we look 5-10 years into the future, what then?
Well, so is their market, right? Their market is 50% NEV now in China. And when we surveyed people in China, 97% of them said yes, they're considering or intending to buy an NEV vehicle. When we did it in the US and in Europe, we got 35 to 40-ish%, I think, and it was flat from the last few years to this year, whereas China's basically gone to full. When you say, well, why is that? Why are people different in China? Well, as I went back to, I can buy, a BYD Song for less than a comparable ICE vehicle. I can't do that here. So consumers in China are making somewhat economical, logical decisions. And if you've then got a charging infrastructure, or if you're concerned about charging and you buy, an extended range EV that's not, 20 miles, it's like 100 miles of range on the battery before even you're using much of it, and you've got 1,000-kilometer range on these things, you've got a very different choice you're giving to the consumer for them to make a rational decision about. That was generated somewhat with some government support and somewhat with 130 companies fighting to the death to innovate and come up with something faster, better, cheaper. The prices of a vehicle here were 35, now at 45. It's hugely increased. In the same time period, China went up a bit and then has come down quite a lot. There's a price war going on in China, and it has been started by Tesla, then the Chinese automakers, now BYD. That's consumer friendly to have that level of competition. And then if they're faced with a faster, better, cheaper choice, they'll start making those choices. If the government's incentives went away, it would dampen demand for sure. We're still in the early stages, innovative, early adopter kind of stuff.
So Akio Toyota says natural demand for pure electric vehicles will top out around 30%. They're going all hybrid with their company reportedly. And I just wonder, is that AlixPartners' view of the world, or do you think it goes higher?
Our data is different. It depends obviously by segments and use cases and regions. But if you looked at countries, in the US, we saw natural demand where you see a bend in the curve of how much cheaper does it have to be, or how much more expensive does it have to be? We saw a natural bend around 70% in the US. So the last 30% in the US would suggest that it's difficult to convert. It was higher, it was like high 70s in Europe. So a natural asymptoting higher. But of course, you can regulate that out of existence too when you get to that point. But no, 30, I think that would be a fairly narrow set of, or today's price. At today's price, it's not even 30, right?
No,
it's 0. You're doing it because it's an innovation. It's neater. It's better in some small different ways, other than some passenger vehicles that are pure commuter, second, third vehicles, some last mile delivery type situations. Very specific use case. It's uneconomic right now.
Mark, what are your ideas of, as legacy automakers or suppliers even, working with the Chinese? So we've seen Carlos Tavares run to Leap Motor in China to get vehicles. we're seeing Chinese suppliers looking to set up shop in Mexico. In fact, reportedly, there's 29 of them who collectively are investing $7 billion to build all kinds of components, not just, advanced ADAS things included. Do you run to them? Or, Xiaomi and Huawei seem to have the lock on UX, right? Of, user interfaces and everything that goes along with it. What would you do as a legacy automaker? Would you do what Tavares has done and run to the Chinese? Would you use these Mexican Chinese suppliers? Would you run to get their UX, or would you say, you know what? I'm just going to become dependent on those guys. They're going to become my dealers. I'm going to be hooked on them. Or do I try to do it in-house?
Well, I mean, BYD is making more than 70% of their content. So they're not dependent on these guys. And they're in China, there's a lot of dual sourcing to put pressure on suppliers in an economic way rather than in a artificial way. And so there's different dynamics to selling to Chinese automakers, but you can make good money on it. And you definitely want, as they are going into Eastern Europe, as into Mexico, if you're a supplier here or a supplier in Europe, you'd want them not to feel the need to open a plant doing what you do here and bringing someone over. Now, if that's BYD, that might be a little bit more difficult with FinDreams and others. So you may be in a situation where you are a second source and you've got to prove yourself and fight. But proving yourself and fighting might make you a more competitive company. Cooperating in a sense like what Stellantis has done, I think they probably felt like they needed to do that. They hadn't really done much themselves, so this was taking something that Leapmotor is not a tier one of the automakers, but had cost competitive small vehicles and are pretty cost conscious as a company, so able to hit price points and launch dates pretty well. And they needed money, they needed a partner, so it sort of fits closer for them, given they really didn't have much to work on, and they pulled back from China. When Jeep's business wound up in, I guess, last year, there really wasn't. It's not like they're cannibalizing something to do that. So it can be. It's just you don't really see BYD or Tesla doing that. So you certainly don't need to do that to succeed in electric vehicles. A more ambitious thing would be to sort of plot a path, if you had the balance sheet to do it, that makes you the winning player in a network in a different way in a 3 to 5 year window.
Mm-hmm.
So getting to the balance sheet, one of the things that you guys asked rhetorically, and this was based on powertrain, it was, how can I afford the cost of financing multiple approaches? Meaning that here in this market, where when one of the car companies reports its financials, they always say, we made a lot of money on our full-size pickup trucks and full-size SUVs, and we're using that for our electric vehicles. Okay, so they're spending money all over the place, and you're talking about doing focus. So how do you achieve this focus when you have this admitted dependence on the other stuff, and then you're saying to yourself, oh, I got to cover all of these bases and spend money here, here, and here.
And you have to spend more on hybrids now, right? Because there's a finite pot, right?
Yeah, and oh, by the way, I've got to do ADAS, and I've got to do, autonomous, and I've got to, I mean, it's just...
It is tough, and this is the first year in a decade where collectively the investment in CapEx and R&D, or last year was significantly up. It was quite flat for a decade before that, even with the shifting to more case-oriented investments. So that is a tough one. It's a tough one, though, that needs to be done saying, I'm not going to try to do everything for every person, but I am going to have different horizons. I have my things now. I have to build my things for the future. And I need to be competitive everywhere I am. I can't accept a subsidy into one. It may not be that your vehicle succeeds, that you launch in a extended range vehicle or a BEV. But then you can't be wedded to it. You've got to stop it early, cut it, and make a new one that's better. And not be wedded to being in a segment for a dealer so that the dealer has a full stack of things to sell. And, if you want this car or this big SUV, Mr. Dealer, you've got to order 10 of my things I'm having a tough time moving. You have to break those incentives and be willing to take the one step back to take two steps forward. And then what you hit the market with has to win, has to be competitive, has to be a step change better. It can't just be getting exposure to it, learning a bit how to do it. It has to be a winning product that everyone believes in and is taking enough reach that it will lose or fail, but it won't be the 5th best vehicle or 10th best vehicle in its segment.
So that sounds like ruthless winnowing. Do we end up with much smaller legacy automakers that offer far fewer models?
They've been winnowing somewhat
They
now.
have, but-
It's the
but
Europeans that are sort of. I've never met a segment they don't like.
Although they're waking up to that.
I think they are. Yeah, I think the body style tweaks of everything. Let's coupe everything with a slight off the back and try to raise the price by 5,000. It's probably played out.
It's played out, and that's it. They did it because they made money at it. I mean, especially the luxury brands, the German luxury brands, they were masters of finding little niches, and as long as the customer paid for it, it was great. But let's go back to what you were just saying, because higher CapEx, in fact, BYD's CapEx last year was $19 billion, twice as much as anybody else. It's a staggering amount of money. Yeah. Shorter product cycles. You're talking 1.5 years, 2 years. You may not be able to recoup your investment in that time. Mm-hmm. Wall Street will excoriate you. You're going to hurt your margins if you do that, right? So how do you, as the officers of a company, commit to a plan where you know that Wall Street's going to garrote you?
You hire engineer business people that don't just put it as a stretch target, that bottom up understand what they're doing to make that work. So, for example, if you look under the hood in a lot of the Chinese vehicles, the engineer in there would say the packaging is awful. What's all this space everywhere? It's because they're using very standardized components that they're not revalidating, that the suppliers have tested, and they're not then doing a ton of vehicle integration. And so when you use a standard component, you can do less vehicle integration. If you're not allowed to go tell that supplier, well, I want the torque curve to be this way, well, then you don't have to go tune in the torque curve. See, it is what it is. Now go figure out in your software how you can deal with that in a different way and make a 95% good vehicle instead of the 99% good vehicle, and do it on time, on budget, and without the pride of having to tweak every last thing and having ride and handling be better than the last vehicle. It might have been good enough the last vehicle. But your technology, your style does need to be fresh and does need to change. Your shock technology is not dramatically changing a lot. I don't say that.
The shock people will not like
they will not say that. They'll totally disagree. But
Right.
If you compare that to the infotainment, or you compare that to some other aspects that are more software based, you'd say, no, it's completely different. And just the opening platform things of having everything going to zonal and central, and then being able to core hop and being able to adjust everything in the vehicle, being able to have that all accessible as an OTA, so you can actually adjust and improve over time and change over time. Those things just didn't exist in the past, right? And so making sure you're staying on the leading edge of those is a lot more important than hitting your requirements on passenger comfort and noise and some ride and handling and some of these other aspects.
And where do you think the legacy automakers are on the software-defined vehicle compared to the Chinese?
Well behind. Tesla is a somewhat exception. It's the legacies are well behind. And I think you only have to see every CEO that goes to China and sits in like the Xiaomi SU7 or other ones and goes, oh, wow. Yep. That drives home that nature of it. And part of it is that clean sheet benefit. It's a little easier to do the clean sheet benefit, and it's easier to run hard when there is no other option. It's harder to do when there is another option, when there is a full-size pickup truck, making more money than the rest of the company combined.
Right.
Is there a possibility that the Chinese companies are going to fall into the same pattern that Western companies have?
Yeah.
In terms of like, oh, we've already got that. Let's just make that incrementally better, and we'll be fine.
Not until there's like 20, 25 of them. If there's over 100 of them, probably not. I think they're terrified of that, and I think they look at the what's happened in the rest of the industry and intensively don't want to become like that. I think Tesla also looks at the industry and doesn't want to become like that either, and is trying to put enough pressure on the system, positive tension on the system to stay in the more 996 environment than the punching of clock environment. So yeah, I think they're deathly afraid of that, particularly that it's difficult for the Chinese brands that are legacy Chinese brands, that are the ICE brands or the state-owned ones, that are having to compete with Xiaopeng and others and BYD and NIO and other ones that are seen as more innovative and are taking share.
Getting back to John's question about Wall Street, when you were describing a company that is willing to kill products rather than, embroidering the seats and putting some stickers outside and selling it as a special edition because they've already paid for the tooling and they want to keep that thing for as long as they can, and companies that are dedicated to achieving more than can be imagined, I began to think, well, are you talking about the car industry or the computer industry? I mean, it just seemed like a disconnect there. But
Yeah.
Okay, so right now, there are 3 companies within 20 miles of the studio, and they've got executives, and the executives have lots of experience, and they probably don't want to go anywhere. So what you're talking about strikes me as being such a massive change. You would have to get many of these people to decide to leave, which then goes to John's point of like, well, would Wall Street feel comfortable with non-car people running car companies in order to achieve these?
Yeah, I don't know that you need non-car people running car companies. I think there needs to be, and generally there tends to be at the top of most companies, people who want to make change. They're not usually just, those aren't clock punchers, right? Those are intense people that are very competitive and want to win and want to change. Some a bit stuck, and some undermined by the evolutionary nature of change in a big organization that hasn't had a fundamental change to the product development process and the sequence of what people do, how things are organized in big ways. Like all of those 3 companies still have a chassis group in purchasing and in engineering that is doing chassis stuff and is interacting with vehicle programs the same way they've been doing, plus or minus, for a long, long, long time. You go to these NEV startups, you go to Tesla, you see much more systems approach and connectedness. You see software teams that are doing things in a very different way, in a very different sprinting way that's decoupled from what these vehicle teams are doing. It's different. And that quantum change is a really difficult one just because it's so holistic, and you need to change so many different pieces while you have an industrial machine and gear turning. It's tough to say, no, I need a new gear.
And what you're getting at is, going back almost to the beginning of this conversation, is why you said you need to grow a whole new company.
I think it's easier that way. And I think it's easier to prevent the millions of little decisions that could undermine the big goal.
Well, another thing, to reorganize the company, it's usually a nightmare. I think back to the GM reorganization of 1984. It essentially destroyed the company as it knew. as it existed at the time. They got rid of Fisher Body. You know, they changed everything.
Yeah.
People for several years had no idea. You know, there was an old ad hoc relationship in the old GM. People knew, hey, if I got to go over to Bob here, or I'm going to call Sue. And when the reorganization happened, nobody knew where anything was going. And so to restructure an existing one that's been around for 100 years and everything, you're asking for a lot of trouble.
Especially if you do it without a really detailed out plan. Like if you go and hope you'll work it out as it goes, that's going to be not so good. And that's where some of those come from, when they're really top down like that, when they aren't as fundamental driven and thought through. You know, what Mullally was doing was very thought through, right? And what Sergio was doing was also very thought through and also very contained. There was nothing that escaped either of those two, right? There was no escape out of the boundary of this is the only way it's going to go in going forward. And so I would say that those two situations, Ford's revamp and avoidance of bankruptcy and how they were organized, what Sergio did with the Chrysler Group and Fiat and FCA, are examples of some things gone right as well with a plan.
But in the more recent Ford reorganization that Farley did, they looked at spinning off the EV business, but they couldn't do it for family ownership reasons. So I guess I just wonder, you know, can they get over some of the really fundamental things that keep them wedded to the past?
I think the question becomes, do you think you're going to be able to sort of react your way through and that's going to work out better? Or is it worth the one step back to take two steps forward? And like when we've looked at this, we've looked at spinning off engine pieces of a business, look at other pieces. There's ways to do it in ways that aren't, you know, second-class citizen, first-class citizen approaches, because there's enough value there, and there's enough things to do, and there's enough honorable work to be done. But there's also decisions that you need the right motivations to make. If you try to do this just by dictum, you would run into a lot of motivations that are and metrics and other things and other limitations for it that in the middle of a company would kill. In the middle and the bottom of the company would turn it into a paper exercise.
So you mentioned the possibility of some people feeling like second-class citizens were a new company to be started. And I mean, and we can see, you know, in history, and again, going back to the General Motors Saturn situation, that the people who were back in Detroit and who are not in Spring Hill, who were working for brands like Oldsmobile, which of course no longer exists, they were just ranting up and down, like, why are they spending the money there? They should give that money to us.
Yeah.
We deserve that money.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I cannot imagine that if there were a startup of something out of General Motors or Ford or even Stellantis that were separate, that the people left behind wouldn't say, that's our money. Why are you spending it over there?
That's the problem. It's not left behind. There's a mission for people to do. If it's really a left behind, then there's probably more transparent, humane, and courageous ways to deal with those pieces, rather than sort of hoping it sort of attrits its way out kind of thing. But those pickup trucks are fantastic vehicles. There's people that know a ton about how to engineer those, how to sell those, how to make those, and they should be really proud of what they do, because Toyota's tried for quite some time and they can't do it. They can't break that stronghold. Nissan's tried, others have tried. So there's reason to be quite proud of what they're doing and get great returns from those. There's also reason, though, to say there's a better way of doing some of this. You don't need necessarily on an SDV for it to be an electric vehicle. The next pickup truck could also be an SDV. You can have a powertrain that's that's decoupled from the software that is running
Zonal
the rest of
computing,
it.
the whole 9
Yeah.
yards.
So it's
Systems engineering, the whole 9 yards.
so it's not that there has to be like the freeze in time business that then repeats and iterates on that. It's changing the way a business works. And so, whether you take the GM approach and say we're all going to change this way, or take the approach of saying, oh, I'm going to separate somehow and make a change, I don't think the story is written on whether one is easier than another. It seems straightforward and more easier to me and more clear to me and less prone to the frozen middle to do it in a separate way, but with clear motivations, clear financial pieces, so that there isn't the, does Saturn or Oldsmobile squawk louder to get the next vehicle? That dynamic is one of the reasons why I think a more clear separation with a constitution of what's spent on what is a lot more.
And do you see that in your 5-year outlook, that some of the legacies will spin off parts of their businesses to
Yes.
operate them more autonomously and independently?
Yes.
Real good. Hey, look, we're at the top of the hour. We're going to have to wrap this up. Mark, awesome having you on the show. This is really good stuff. It's amazing to watch what's going on right now.
It's fun. It's a fun time to be in the industry. So much change.
It is, right. Keith, great having you back.
Thanks
on
for
the
having
show,
me on.
too. And let's do another show next week, Gary.
Do that.
Okay. Want to thank all of you for having tuned in.
AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.